Before we begin, I want to take a quick moment to thank the sponsor of this event, First Response. As a trusted brand for those trying to conceive, First Response is committed to providing not only accurate results when it matters most, but also meaningful support and resources throughout your fertility journey. First Response is a fantastic partner of Fertility Matters, and we're thrilled to partner with them on this event today. So we're going to, without further ado, we're going to get everybody, we're going to get Dr. Baratz and Sara to talk a little bit about their practices, but a bit of housekeeping. Please keep your mics muted. And if you have questions, please populate them in the chat. This is meant to be an interactive conversation, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can today. So Dr. Baratz, I'll start with you. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
I was going to let Sara go first just to out of courtesy, but thank you for the introduction, Carolyn. And again, thank you for hosting this important topic. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for everyone that's listening, because this is an aspect of fertility care that is probably not as straightforward as other journeys, but has the potential to be very successful and very gratifying. So in terms of who I am, as you described, I am a physician who works on the front line with IVF in an IVF center. We do have a practice that includes a significant amount of third-party reproduction, which encompasses, and I think we'll talk about definitions in a moment, but encompasses all aspects of third-party reproduction, including journeys that involve that are more on the independent side, or those that involve agencies and other providers. And I'm here in Toronto, Canada, and I think there's significance to that as well. That's a little bit about me. I'm not sure if you wanted any more detail, like my favorite ice cream flavor or vegetable.
His favorite part of the country seems to be Atlantic Canada, which is where I am.
It's a nice part, but it is interesting how this is not just a provincial, because provincial issues are usually what we think of when we think of healthcare. This is a national issue, and it's actually international as well, because we're involving a lot of stakeholders.
Yeah, fantastic. And Sara.
Hi, and Ari, that's okay. I won't take it personally that I have to go second, but my name is Sara Cohen. My practice is Fertility Law Canada. I'm also past president of Fertility Matters Canada, and so thrilled with all the organization's growth and movement. So my entire practice is fertility law. I don't also do divorce law or anything else like this. I've worked with about 3,500 people involved in third-party reproduction. So most of my practice are intended parents. A lot of them, though, are donors and surrogates. And as Ari was saying, this is a little bit unique because both provincial law really applies, like who is a parent is dealt with on a provincial basis, but we deal with so much trans-provincial and even transnational fertility third-party work that it becomes extremely collaborative and, to be honest, a little bit more complicated than a lot of people tend to think it's going to be. When I say complicated, though, I don't want people to feel that this means it's not doable. It's very doable. We both, Ari and I, do lots and lots of this work every year. It's just, take the time to kind of do your research and make sure your steps are in place early on. And I also have to say that I'm thrilled with the amount of people who are out here today. I've been practicing in this area exclusively for about 15 years. And although I will say there is still stigma, it is so much less than it was before. And I think just the numbers of people participating in this conversation is really indicative of that. And it warms my heart and makes me happy for all of the people involved, but probably the people it makes me the most happy for are the donor-conceived people and these people who are conceived through third-party reproduction, because we really want to normalize this situation for everyone.
Right. I think I'd like to add a comment about the magnitude piece, which is there's so much press and acknowledgement that IVF fertility treatments have been around for 4 or 5 decades. But when we talk about third-party reproduction, that has really come out of the shadows in the last, I would say, decade and a half. And I think part of it, the medicine, is probably not what's really been driving it. It's been more the legislation. Like in my practice, we can clearly see spikes in consumption of third-party reproduction around law. Like when the laws in Ontario changed about the definitions of marriage, boom, we saw a huge spike in consumption. Right now, as we see, there are improvements both at the federal and provincial level on how we relate to all parties involved in third party. We're starting to see another spike. And then geopolitically, as we see changes in the world, Canada becomes this real focus for third-party reproduction, which is another potentially controversial area.
Amazing. So let's get back to basics. Let's talk about what third-party reproduction is. Dr. Baratz, do you want to tell everybody, for those of those people who...
So third-party reproduction is defined as the use of one of the key components to make a baby, have a live birth, by using a source that is not directly involved with the intended parent. And that can be either the egg source in the form of an egg donor. It can be the sperm source in the form of a sperm donor. It can actually be a donated embryo if the egg and sperm are already generated, or it can be actually a gestational carrier, or what's referred to as a surrogate mother. And what's also interesting is, even though we're talking about defining third-party reproduction, just again to history, actually the first type of third-party reproduction predates IVF. I mean, if you go to the Bible, Abraham and Sara, if you read the Old Testament, there's description of some type of infertility, and there's description of using another female or woman born with a uterus and ovaries to carry one of Abraham's children. So if you believe in that story, but the fact that already at the most fundamental levels of our historical record, people are talking about reproduction in a third-party way. It is interesting that we're referring to this as third-party reproduction, because the nomenclature, although third-party does seem simple for people to understand, it can be off-putting for some, and some people talk about it as like they have other terms for this, sort of like collaborative family building is another term. I'm not sure where I land on that just yet, but because sometimes people, third-party, it almost has the impression that we're outsourcing the baby making part, that's that I won't be involved with it. But it's the actual opposite, is that people that are using third-party reproduction, even with that term, are very, very much involved, even though they're using an alternate source.
Amazing. And Sara, who typically considers using third-party reproduction, or donor gametes, a surrogate, and why are those decisions made?
I think that really who we see who involves themselves in third-party reproduction just runs the gamut. So we've got heteronormative couples who perhaps, either are missing whether it's certain body parts are not working the way we wish they were, or certain gametes aren't working the way we wish they were, or if, whether it's like they've gone through cancer, or have had a hysterectomy, et cetera, et cetera. So we have lots of heteronormative couples who are our clients, and then we've got single people who are our clients. Lots of the LGBTQ community work within the third-party reproduction sphere, and then transgender clients who are part of the LGBTQ group too use third-party reproduction. So it's basically across all walks of life and all different people. And something that I think is very beautiful is there is not really a definition that is extremely kind of old-fashioned or heteronormative about what makes a family and who is a parent. As Ari was touching on before, every province has a completely different idea of who makes a parent. I happen to be in Ontario. I work across the country, but I'm very proud to have played a very small part in making it be what it is. But Ontario legislation is particularly good because it really recognizes that a family can kind of be who we intend for it to be. And when we use the word third party, like Ari said, it's someone who, I don't see it as outsourcing. I just see it as a third party they're not a parent, basically. I do like the term collaborative family building. I like a lot of these different terms, but something that's near and dear to my heart is the idea that Um, it doesn't have to be like strangers, and it often isn't. So it's people coming together to help build a family, someone else's family. I'm personally not scared of this at all. Our legislation has made it very strong in places like Ontario. But I think people, both organically and with the help of often a really great fertility counselor, develop, and the rest of their team develop kind of what they want this process to look like. And I think it can be really, really beautiful and special.
I'd like to add to that, and if you don't mind, Caroline, every time you ask a question, I think it's good to have, it'd be useful to have both the legal and medical commentary on it, because I think there's different triggers that you want to comment on. But the way we look at it would be very often through medical, non-medical application of third party. So there are certain, obviously, hard medical reasons that people would need to consider third party. And then when you drive into the different components, whether it's sperm or egg or surrogacy, in the medical space, we typically have a division of oncologic, so cancer-based reasons, non-cancer-based reasons, because certainly there'd be medical reasons that are non-cancer that would require one to consider using any of those third-party sources. And we also have to appreciate that when you're talking about third party, sometimes there are third party avoidance strategies, right? Like, for example, in the cancer situation, very often we try our best as fertility providers to protect people against possibly needing third party, but we also mention third party as an option as a backup. For some people, they've known this from day one of their development when they were seeing their family doctor or gynecologist or urologist that they would require support. And so very often I inherit patients in my practice who were, let's say, at Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto, sent to me from one of the pediatric gynecologists, knowing they were born without a uterus, and knowing that their family building journey would include surrogacy as an example. So many different pathways that lead to accessing the third party space of fertility care.
Amazing. And Dr. Baratz, what are the key clinical pathways for people considering third party in Canada?
Well, we just actually, that's a nice lead in. We just touched on it. So, I mean, most, at least in Canada, and because fertility, which is the overarching umbrella of third party reproduction, is part of the medical space, it typically starts with a referral from a family physician, nurse practitioner, physician assistant, a primary provider. That would be the most common pathway. So, doctor, I want to have a baby with my partner. Doctor, I have severe endometriosis. I'm planning a surgery. Doctor, my husband or my partner or my wife is going through chemotherapy. We need some possible third party fertility / third party assistance. So the primary provider might not be fully aware that third party is part of the fertility journey. In fact, I would say the patient or the consumer might be more aware of that. So I would say that's probably one of the bulk. The other, and then there are, again, subspecialties. So someone may have come to us from the pediatrics clinic or the oncology clinic. I would say the other clinical pathway is inside of the clinic. So I have quite a few patients who started in, let's call it more predictable pathway, first party or non-third party pathway, and things weren't working out. And so so there are questions coming up on the chat. Carolyn, are you keeping track of those?
Yeah.
Great. So they may have, their gynecologist or fertility doctor may have said, look, we've tried our best with plan A, it's not working. We need to look at other options. And so they're coming from an internal referral. So I'll say to my patient, look, we've done a number of IVF treatments with you. We're not able to produce enough embryos to help build your family. Let's consider another source. So I would say those are the main clinical pathways, and the other pathways are outside of the medical space, other professionals or stakeholders. For example, Sara, she's a great supporter of not just my practice, but many physicians. She's very aware of how to connect with the clinical pathways, and many of the lawyers that operate in Canada have connections with fertility clinics as another source for referral. And then finally, any of the representatives of the various egg banks, egg donation agencies, or surrogacy agencies are aware that physicians like myself exist, and they will assist in reaching out. I think there are also conferences. I know there are also conferences that people can attend that focus on third-party reproduction, and they are essentially a collection of various clinics, lawyers, and agencies that can provide alternate clinical pathways?
Mm.
If you don't mind, I'm just going to touch on that, Carolyn.
Yeah.
So a few different things. I'm really lucky that I get a lot of, I call them clients, Ari calls them patients directly and from the very get-go. I don't know how typical that is within my role, but I'm really, really fortunate to have that situation. I appreciate it because there's people that I really completely trust, like Dr. Baratz, and I can, make sure people are in hands that I think are very good, and work with them. I think it's really important that you work with anyone who you trust and you really knows what they're doing in the fertility sphere within Canada, because there's a lot of people who dabble and it's just not helpful because it's going to take you a lot longer. You're going to have to backtrack. It's not a great idea. With respect to those conferences Dr. Baratz was talking about, I mean, they can be great, but please be careful because it's, as I would say, pay to play. So the people who are speaking have paid to speak, and including like sometimes me, sometimes Dr. Baratz's clinic, etc. So it's not necessarily like, just be always aware of what's going on around you. Like these are, some of them could be the best, but they're not there because they're the best. So do your research and then find your team. Build your team, people you trust, and the referrals within that team are going to be really useful. And make sure it's not really about business relationships. It's not groups who always send to each other just simply because they make money off of each other, but really are kind of making a team that you think is like your superstar team, best of the best, in my opinion. And there are different aspects that you need to think about. So Dr. Baratz was talking about things like, egg banks, sperm banks, etc. And that can be a valuable source, but I think a lot of people don't even necessarily know that there are some very good reasons about perhaps not using an egg bank or a sperm bank and maybe considering a known donor. And there's lots of different pieces of the puzzle that you will have to consider, which piece is the most important to you, because it's never just going to be the medicine. It's never just going to be the law. And I think probably the most important piece is always what is best for your child. So I know sometimes we're so busy getting pregnant ourselves, and a lot of people have gone through such awful experiences to get where we're getting and such challenges. And of course, we want to respect that. We want a positive pregnancy. We want a healthy birth. And we want to remember that that's just the beginning for this person. They've got an entire life after that. So the decisions we make at the beginning can really affect them. So just make sure we're not only looking at one aspect, but considering whether it's legal, medical, but also counseling. There's lots of different pieces of this puzzle that should be thought out before you get started, because, gametes are forever, for example. So like kind of think things through, not just for that immediate pregnancy, but going forward into the future.
I'd like to follow up with a comment on that, Carolynn, which is just on the medical side. It's very important that even though we use the term third-party reproduction and it has this connotation that it's done somewhere else or at the fringe of the clinic, it is definitely part of the clinic. I mean, quality and safety of third-party reproduction, at least on the medical side, lies on the physicians, the nurses, the providers. And so I want it to be very clear with our audience that wherever you decide to do your third-party reproduction, whether it's in Ontario, somewhere else in Canada, that you're relying not just on the clinic, but that the clinic is accredited with the college of your province, Accreditation Canada, the CMPA, like the CMPA. You can back check all of these things, and that leads into the other consideration, which is this is a conversation on third-party reproduction in Canada, but would someone consider doing third-party reproduction in another country or another jurisdiction? And again, as you move further away from where you started, you may be compromising on quality and on safety. And I always tell patients, like, the only thing worse than not finding your sperm, egg, or donor or surrogate when you want it is finding not a good one or having a bad outcome, because it's very, very difficult to undo those decisions. So quality and safety, very high on the priority list.
Yeah, this is such a rich conversation. Two things that are really, being highlighted, I think, for me, over the last few minutes. Number one, that, okay, we've got intended parents. So those are the people who are looking to take on this baby. This is also, we need to consider surrogates. and their safety and their relationship. Donors, so whether that's ova, sperm, or embryo donor, but also donor conceived people and I feel that a lot of times, and potentially maybe, we're in this mix, we want someone to get pregnant and take home this baby, of course, but at the end of the day, there is a life that will be created, and that's an important consideration, and really, really important group of people to involve in the conversation. And the other thing that I think I'm gonna take you down this path right now is I want to touch on barriers to care. I see some high level conversation happening here. And something that we see, so as part of Fertility Matters Canada, we have a significant online community. We are the voice of the Canadian fertility patients. So we hear a lot. We hear a lot, especially from intended parents. And from surrogates, and we hear the experiences, the good and the not so good. And I'm curious. So one of the things, and it may be that I'm more aware of it because I live in Atlantic Canada. So I live in a province, or at least in a part of this country, where access to care and even the knowledge and information within primary care providers, for example, isn't as strong as somewhere as maybe Montreal, Toronto, certainly Vancouver, some of the bigger city centers. And so I'd love to dive into some of the barriers patients face when navigating this path to parenthood.
Who gets to go first?
Let's go with Sara first.
Okay, so the challenges are significant, and I actually think there's a lot of advocacy work we need to do on that. And as you were mentioning, a lot of it's family doctors who maybe don't, time is not your friend when you're coming to dealing with fertility issues. And it's actually some advocacy work we need to do. And I really hope that everyone is a good advocate for themselves with their own doctor. You need to sometimes be brave and do that. As Carolyn mentioned, I'm in Toronto and we are so lucky. We have so many clinics. And when it comes to third-party reproduction, in my opinion, we have the best clinics in the country in the Toronto area for third-party reproduction. So Carolyn, when I have clients in Atlantic Canada, honestly, to goodness, I'll be like, fly to see Dr. Baratz because it's just going to be, and it's going to end up being faster. And the truth is, it's kind of the pieces of the puzzle, making sure they work smoothly together. This is already so stressful. There's already so many different pieces of the puzzle. It's not all that popular to say, but until a clinic has their third-party reproduction program down, it's not very popular to say, but like, I don't want my clients to be guinea pigs anywhere. Like, I want to go somewhere where it's going to be really, really smooth. They have lots of experience with third-party reproduction. Something that's a little confusing about that, though, is different clinics have different philosophies. So, for example, there are some clinics who won't use a donor through an agency. I see someone, Katie, I think, touched on that issue about whether it's better to use a bank versus using an agency. I personally don't love banks. We can talk about that another time or whenever you want. But there are some clinics that won't touch donors from an agency. And I also think it's not really fair because patients or clients, who, however you want to refer in this situation, don't necessarily know that when they're working with a clinic, and they think that those are their only options. And that's not necessarily the case. There's someone like Dr. Baratz whose program is pretty flexible. So, I'm not concerned that if someone goes to see him, they're going to be getting a limited snapshot about what are their options. But as you were mentioning, the people who are not at, even just all over the country, but specifically not in Toronto, really are at a disadvantage, and that's just awful, but it's the truth. The other thing I'll mention is even people who are in different parts of the country, you could do surrogacy with your sister, your friend, your hairdresser's barista's daughter. Like, it happens all the time. But places like New Brunswick, which I believe is where you're from, Carolyn, other than Quebec, which has just the worst legislation ever, it's so bad. New Brunswick's the next worst in the entire country as far as the strength of the parental rights for the parents to that child. So that's another disadvantage. I mean, the other challenge that I'm sure we'll talk about more, but we haven't touched on yet, and I know I'm so glad Fertility Matters is super involved in leading this charge right now, is really just access to donor gametes, access to surrogates. And there are so many people, we can definitely talk about internationally, where Canada is an awesome option for many reasons, but even domestically, it is hard for Canadians to access donor gametes, donor embryos, surrogates. In my opinion, a big part of that is because we criminalize compensated gamete donation, criminalize compensated surrogacy, and to my mind, we do that at the expense of some really important things like having children, donor conceived people who aren't all related to each other, because that's important to me. We don't have our own national registry, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of reasons this is a problem, but simply having access to lots of choice within donors in Canada and access to surrogates is probably the biggest challenge, I would say.
And I would assume diversity within the donor population, but also diversity within the surrogate community as
I
well.
would say with donor gametes, for some people, heritage background is super important, and that makes good sense. And you know, ever since 2004, when Canada criminalized compensated gamete donation, so it's punishable of up to 10 years in jail and or $500,000. We went from about 20 sperm banks across the country to what, at least at the time, up until recently, was one national sperm bank. I think they're still running. And that sperm bank often has like 20 donors a year. And we don't have limits on how many times we're using those donors again and again and again. There's some communities. So for example, gay women are using a lot of donor sperm, and if they're in a social group perhaps that has a lot of other gay women in it, we know a lot of these kids are going to be related to each other. If you are of a specific background, racial heritage, etc., if you want a Black donor, you want an Asian donor, it really becomes extremely limited, and that ends up meaning we're importing something like 95% of our donor sperm from the United States, where it's paid for anyways. These tend to be anonymous sperm donation, which means
Sorry, when you say paid for, you mean the donor has been compensated?
yes, and yes, the donor's been compensated, but outside of Canada. In the United States, it's owned now by the sperm bank or owned by the egg bank, and therefore you're not breaking Canadian law. To make a long story short, it's illegal to purchase sperm from a donor or someone acting on behalf of a donor, but it's not just illegal to purchase sperm. It's not just illegal to purchase eggs. It's like a nuanced loophole in the law. I'm not sure it was intended, but there it is. And we're basically we're not able to provide in Canada donors who are of the heritage, racial background people are looking for, diverse enough, just enough so that we're not using the same donors again and again. We don't have a donor registry, and we end up relying on anonymous or open identification donors, which in my opinion is still not enough in Canada, far more than I think Canadians really would want to once they've already gotten the counseling background and considered the perspective of the donor conceived person. So for me, the limiting factor, as Ari was mentioning, it's legislation sometimes. That is the limiting factor, the federal legislation in my mind.
I'd just like to comment. So there's no question that third-party reproduction is not easy, but when I think of barriers, I think of a barrier as something that I can try and navigate and I can overcome, as opposed to a formal blockade. So we do have to have some level of perspective that in spite of all of these barriers, we still help people, Sara, myself, you, Carolynn, we help people every day move and help this space mature more and more. And the last 5 years of how provincially and federally we handle this the next 5 years will look very different. because the advocacy work that's been done from all the people on this screen, and I know there's some people even outside of the panel. So, but if you ask me specifically, what are the biggest barriers? I think of barriers or influences or levers that we need to pull is there's sort of three of them. There's the medical, there's, let's call it the emotional, psychosocial, and the financial, and in addition to the legal. I think the medical is actually one of the lowest barriers because you're getting a medical opinion, and once you're moving into third party, as per the comments, you're usually dealing with a very niche, nuanced clinical space. So it wouldn't be unreasonable for you to move outside of your province or city to get the expertise. But what's probably the most challenging from my perspective is, and we know what to do medically and to keep pushing that forward, but I think the emotional piece is a massive, massive, massive barrier. And the financial reality, that's a lever that many couples just can't pull. And so fortunately, with some of the new laws that have just come up in the last couple of months, we've seen huge improvements that I think will actually enable people to come back over that financial barrier, and that will pull along the emotional barrier as well. But medically, I don't want people to think that medically the third party is that much more complicated than other aspects of fertility care. It's easy to make it go to not handle it properly if you're not in the right clinic, but it is a very doable process. I think it's just that desire to do it and to be able to finance it, which are the massive challenges.
Yeah, and I would agree that when you look at it holistically, the medical piece does seem to be the lowest barrier, the thing that's more easy to navigate.
Like just to give a real example, like let's say someone did live in Atlantic Canada. So maybe their egg donor or surrogate is not being worked up in Atlantic Canada, but we have many collaborative relationships with all of the clinics in the East Coast where we'll do some type of hybrid protocol. We'll manage their donor, their surrogate. Their intended parent comes from maybe Fogo Island, where I visited last summer, and we'll work together with those clinics so that they're not totally displaced, and that applies to the donors and the surrogates. So that's the nice thing I think about the Canadian, this perceived geographic barrier, is that movement inside of our province. It's not completely seamless, but it definitely has seams that we can track and channels that we can follow.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about the legalities and some of the considerations that intended parents in particular need to consider. So what are the steps that intended parents need to take? So they've decided this is the next step. They are going to move down a donor or a surrogacy journey. So what do they need to do to protect themselves? And then on the other side, what are the considerations for surrogates and or donors? And then after that, what are the legal rights and responsibilities of intended parents versus surrogates or donors? Sara, let's start with you.
Okay, this is a long question, so and it's got sub questions within the question. So we're gonna
Sara, can you
start
repeat the question as you answer it, just so that it's clear for everyone?
Yeah, I feel like
Let's
we need to
start
make
with
a
the steps
chart.
that they need to take to legally protect themselves.
What, pardon? Which? What?
The intended parents or surrogates and donors, what do they need to consider? What do they need to do in order to protect themselves?
Okay, so I know I do, and I think almost every fertility lawyer in Canada does provide free consultations. You need a consultation because there's a lot of factors that need to be considered. And if we're talking about surrogacy, those considerations are quite different than they are about whether it's sperm donation, egg donation, or embryo donation. A lot of different pieces how they play out matter. So, for example, in Ontario, we can do surrogacy that's with a donor embryo, but we can't do that if the baby's been born in Alberta. So you need to kind of know how the pieces work together. So please get your consultation before you even begin. Do not offer to pay anybody. I know a lot of people really want to, because whether it's just practically they think that makes sense, and why in the world would anyone be a surrogate or a donor without being paid? And then also people are just truly grateful. And by the way, they would be a surrogate or a donor without being paid. We can talk about that later. But a lot of people think right away that's their first instinct to offer to pay. Do not do it. It's punishable by up to 10 years in jail and or $500,000. Working with an agency can have some legal implications. There's pieces of legislation that are actually a little bit unclear when it comes to surrogacy agencies. So it's worth talking about that too before you kind of look into that. If you're looking into international surrogacy, for example, we've got to start worrying about what's going to happen when your baby's born internationally. How are we going to get your child Canadian citizenship? How are we getting them back into Canada? So I can't give you a really quick, concise answer, Carolyn, because there's just so much within there that you're
You
asking
did give an
about.
answer, you did give an answer, which is have a good lawyer. I mean, that's your answer.
Talk to a lawyer. I mean, you're welcome to talk to me. I give free consultations, but I think so do other lawyers too across Canada, some of them.
I think I'm just
So
going to reframe what you're saying, just so people are clear. Like what you're saying is this is not the type of thing you want to do it yourself, like by watching a
bad
YouTube
idea.
video. This is something that you want a professional. It's worth the resources spent because to backtrack is very, very complicated. That's essentially, that would be my answer because that's what I do. I just tap on Sarah's email and say, please help this couple because you're the best, or someone in your field.
Yeah, I just had a email this morning, like an hour before we jumped on, of someone who's like, oh, I just had a baby born in Sri Lanka through surrogacy and I'm not able to get on the birth certificate. Now what do I do? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I really wish we would have talked before because this one's going to be a challenging one. So please, just that's the quick
Yeah, I
answer.
want to be very clear. Like I have many patients who are professionals who are lawyers who say, I'm a tax lawyer. I went to law school. I can download this agreement. I can chat GBT it. And I think this is where ChatGPT doesn't work very well, right? There are legislations, there are laws that we're not experts on. So it does sound a bit self-serving when it comes from Sarah. So I'm going to say on her behalf is that whether it's Sarah or the group, I mean, there is actually a group in Canada of leaders in this space provincially. So we're just using Sarah because she's online, but that kind of person is definitely part of your starting point because if you're too deep into an agreement, either it'll become illegal or it will break, and then we're in trouble. What was
And
the
then
second
there's
question?
places like Ontario actually require you to get independent legal advice. It can't be yourself. Okay.
Yeah.
What was the second question?
The second question are now, what are the legal rights and responsibilities of intended parents and surrogates and or donors?
I wish I could tell you they had more legal rights. I don't really think anyone's got great legal rights. So there are provinces that have better, cleaner legal rights. So for example, Ontario, a donor, really we have under Section 5 of the Children's Law Reform Act, a donor is not a parent. This is a great thing. The donors generally do not want to be parents. They're not looking to be parents. They want to be protected against child support. And the intended parents want to know that their family is safe and secure, that the donor's not going to come up one day and say that they're the parent. But first of all, not every province has that. But on top of that, we allow, as I think we should, non-heteronormative family buildings. We allow 3 parents, 4 parents, etc. So we've got to be very clear who is a donor and who's not a donor. So in terms of that, I think clarity is important. It's really, really in places like Ontario, when it comes to surrogacy, that the legislation is pretty good. The case law is great. It's about intention. Who intends to be a parent prior to conception? This is not something you can enter into an agreement once someone's pregnant or even just once the pregnancy is confirmed. Can't do that. And who intends not to be a parent. But at the end of the day, in every single province across Canada, technically, if a surrogate would change her mind, it doesn't say anywhere that she can't. Our law is not the way it is like in California, etc. We have never had anywhere in Canada a gestational surrogate. That's when the surrogate is not genetically related to the baby. We have never, to the best of my knowledge, had a gestational surrogate try to keep a baby. Okay. But if she did, and especially I would say when it comes to a traditional surrogacy, which is where she is genetically related to the baby, and the clinics tend to do that less, a lot of that happens outside of a clinic. What would happen? It would be wrong if someone gave you a guarantee. I'm with gestational surrogacy, that's done properly and obviously done in a clinic, gestational surrogacy, and you've got counselors involved and you've got the legal part done well. I'm really not all that concerned. But they're not great. We also don't have legislation the way they do in places also like California, Arizona, Illinois, etc., that say, the surrogate's entitled to choose her own doctor. The surrogate is entitled to X, Y, and Z being paid for. The surrogate's entitled to choose where she gives birth. And we don't have something like a donor registry, which is both the donor conceived people and the donor could perhaps find out identifying information about each other. So I think in Canada, it's really, really well done. I think we do a great job, but it's not because there's rights. It's because we contract for these rights and make sure this is back. And the clinics participate in that, like they're on board with involving like steps that aren't just about getting pregnant, but about doing it properly. But the idea of rights aren't really there.
That's so interesting. I know we still have work to do on legislation and rights and lots of those things. So that's some of the work that we do at Fertility Matters, and we'll be looking for more people to get involved in some of that work in the coming months. So stay tuned. I am going to jump to the comments because we've had quite a few questions come in. So I'd like to get to some of those. This is a very rich conversation, and I hope everybody that's watching today is really taking so much from this. From Deb, I'm interested in the requirements to accept donated embryos from the US into a Canadian medical practice for implantation. I would assume a embryo transfer. Specifically, what regulations differ in a meaningful way where the US standards are not sufficient, and how best to navigate them?
Do you want to answer, Sarah, or?
Well, yes, I'm happy to, but I do think it's really important to understand that every clinic's going to have their own way of dealing with things.
I can comment as well, but I just want to give you a first crack at it, and then.
My only first crack, and then I'll let Ari deal with it because he's in the clinic. I don't deal with the actual testing or anything like that. But my only first crack is I kind of think it's odd, and I think Deb, we've spoken about this before, actually, if I recall who you are, that there are. We have really strict regulations about importing donor eggs. We have really strict regulations about importing donor sperm. But if an embryo is already created for someone else's reproductive purpose, and then there's excess embryos, and those are being donated to someone in Canada, our actual regulations don't specify very much about what has to, like our safety of sperm and ova regulations don't apply to the embryos in that situation if they were not created in like for use with a surrogate or to donate.
So the short answer, so thank you, Sarah. I mean, so the short answer is very doable. First of all, the United States, which falls under FDA, is in many areas as strict, if not stricter than Health Canada. So there's a very good chance if it was done at a fertility clinic in the United States that it would be FDA approved and would have no issue receiving it. Because you don't just want these things to satisfy the regulations. You want them to be safe and of quality for yourself and for your surrogate. So I would have a consultation with your clinic in terms of the application, whether it's to you or a gestational carrier, but very, very doable. And I do think that the way embryos are handled is different than the way eggs and sperm are, and it does seem to me a bit of like a gray area, but I would interpret the gray as a bad thing. It's that we're doing the right thing, right? So these embryos, there's no reason why they shouldn't be properly managed. And I would actually say that the standards in the US in some areas when it comes to viral transmission, genetics, are as rigorous, if not more, than ours. So I would have pretty high level confidence that you'll be able to. But the other option would be, if you speak with your physician providers, you could use some type of hybrid protocol. You could leave the embryos where they are, travel to the US, have an embryo transfer there, and just come home. It's another option. It might be simpler. So I think you have to weigh out the medical opportunity, let's call it the emotional, psychosocial level of displacement, and what it's going to cost you financially. But that all would fall under having a physician. And by the way, all my comments on the medical side are just curbside, like they're not, I don't know how deep you are into your process, but you do have our contact emails, and we're happy to help direct you to the proper physician or lawyer.
Absolutely. What are some of the things to consider between using a bank versus using an agency to find a donor?
Sarah, do you want to comment, or I can do
Yeah, that's
medical and you can do,
something.
I can do medical, you can do legal if you want.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of what I do legally isn't only legal, and you'll probably get that from a lot of my answers. So, there's just, I think they're very different processes. And I think really this is one of those times where you have to look at the donor conceived person and what this is going to look like. So, a successful pregnancy, of course, is really important, but what are we looking at down the road? From my perspective, I'm very pro a known donor, and I don't necessarily mean someone you know today or friend of a friend. I mean, you can. There's a number of agencies that operate in terms of connecting intended parents and donors. For me, when we're talking about donor ova and donor embryos, that's really the way to do it. And that is because, as we were mentioning before, the donor conceived person and the donor and the parents, other than deciding who is a parent and who's not a parent, there aren't really any rights. So if we want to know information, basically we're worried about, is this child going to have sexual intercourse with someone else they're genetically related to? How many times that donor's donated in the past? What happens if in the future the donor learns more information about their health, their parents' health, their siblings' health, their children's health, or any kids who were conceived through the use of their donor? And another time, if you want to exchange that, you're really going to have to effectively do that through a known donor agreement. If you use it through a donor egg bank, some of them, WSA, I really like. As far as egg banks go, I'm really happy with them. And price is a problem for sure for egg banks, but you're buying a lot. And when I don't say a lot, I don't mean many. I mean a space lot, which usually is about like 6 eggs, depending on it. One thing with that is you're only getting the 6. If you're doing a cycle with a donor who's coming to your clinic, you're getting all of the eggs that are retrieved from that one cycle. So all of the embryos. If you care very much about your children, you want more than one child being genetically related to each other through the donor, then this is really important that you have more than, just 6 eggs from that one donor. I think you're going to have a lot more information if you do it through a known donor. You do not, so WSA, it's great. I'm just using them as an example because that's the question, but whatever it is, you are contracting directly with that egg bank. That egg bank's directly contracting with that donor, but you and the donor don't have any contact or contract. You can't enforce an agreement you didn't sign with the donor. You're not part of their agreement. So we have case law where, for example, there's a case with Zytex where Canadians imported sperm from that sperm bank into Canada, and they were told, if I remember correctly, about the donor was healthy, no mental issues, went to Princeton, I think it was, all these things, and it ended up being, they found out the donor had schizophrenia, never graduated college, etc., etc., and these intended parents sued the sperm bank because their child had certain medical issues through the schizophrenia, for example, that could have been maybe shared with them. But in that case, Zytex was protected because their contract with the intended parents is simply like, we are relying on whatever the sperm donor tells us. That's all there is to it. And we're not going in to make sure they graduated college just because I said to make sure they don't have mental health issues. I think the doctors could handle a lot more of that. And then it could be, if it's just a sperm bank, like signing off and saying, this is what they've told us, that's all there is to it. So for me, I would always go the other way, but I leave that to Ari to discuss from the medical perspective, the differences.
You're stealing my medical thunder. That's okay.
Go for it.
Well, with gametes, banks, sperm and egg are obviously different. In terms of the efficacy, there's been a long-standing debate of, I'm going to speak about eggs right now, because with sperm, there's no issue with fresh or frozen. It works just as well. But the question about eggs has been an ongoing research question. It looks like fresh eggs are probably a little bit more efficient than frozen eggs, than banked eggs, but both have high efficacy. So if I was in a jurisdiction where I could only use frozen banked eggs, I would not bat an eye. It would be an excellent option. But it does touch on some of the financial and family building aspirations that you have. There's no question that, like, for example, in our clinic, we're very focused on the fresh egg live, either anonymous or known donor option. From a medical perspective, we will get more eggs, we'll make more embryos, we'll help people have more consistency in their family. But if I was, let's say, someone who's had a very specific racial background or ethnic background, and I was having trouble, you might be more successful with the frozen eggs. So both are on the table. I mean, I'd rather have an egg than no egg. I mean, that's really the bottom line. And also we've had amazing success with both options. In terms of the safety, though, I think that's a piece that also has evolved as well, because when the donor sperm and donor egg process started, it was before the age of really extensive expanded genetic carrier screening. But now, because we have more tools to evaluate, and not just genetic causes, like if you're going to get cystic fibrosis or Tay-Sachs disease, but a myriad, like hundreds and hundreds of genetic conditions. And there's even other type of testing that's coming down the pipeline to do what's called polygenic screening for things like autism and mood disorders. So anytime you rely on someone's history, there's always going to be recall issues. Like, did they tell me the whole story? And we have to hope that people are acting in good faith. But right now, most programs are using expanded genetic carrier screening for all those other rare conditions that could pop up. So that's an important piece too, is the medical screen. Forgot what the question was, but it was fresh versus frozen. Both, by the way, both for fresh eggs and frozen eggs, there is opportunity to have genetic screening available. And most clinics are using this now as a standard.
Yeah, I think we've got time for at least one more. This question comes from Crystal. I wish home insemination was more accepted. The fertility clinic we were working with wouldn't do anything because we wanted to do home insemination, but they wouldn't do cycle monitoring or try ovulation inducing drugs. Ari, do you want to, I know you don't know the more specifics, but could you comment?
Well, I mean, home insemination. I mean, I think the nice thing about the AHR Act and about the way the federal and provincial jurisdictions are dealing with this, which is that we don't really want to get into people's homes. We just want to protect people at the clinic level. Not to say that we want anything bad to happen. I think if you have a consultation with your physician and you appreciate the transmission risks, some of the risks around medication, exposure, and you still choose to do home insemination, there should really be no problem with that. And especially if you're able to produce some legal protections. I mean, having things like legal protections, viral screening, counseling is not just there to satisfy the regulations, but it's there to protect you and your donor and your surrogate and your family and your unborn child. So if you're looking at it through that lens, then I don't see why it can't be offered or supported. If you look at it through just trying to cut corners, I think you're going to run into some problems. So that's the best medical advice I can give: is see your physician, see your lawyer, and try and bake out a scenario that's safe for everybody.
I actually see lots of home insemination, and often when I see it, it's for people who don't necessarily have any fertility issues. It just might be within their family. There's nobody with sperm. So often gay women or single women involved in home insemination, and a friend of theirs comes, gives them their sample, and that's what they do. But in order to do this, we do enter into legal agreements in advance, and we should get independent legal advice for the donor. Personally, when I'm doing third-party work, it's not that a counselor is required by law. There is no requirement anywhere in Canada at this point to have a counselor, but I require it in my retainer. I say, like, you need to work with a counselor. I can't do this for you because I'm very well aware. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a counselor. I'm just the lawyer. But it is within certain communities, it's really quite accepted, and I don't see a problem with that. Sometimes it's they might choose it because financially is more feasible, but sometimes people say, I don't want to be with a doctor because I don't have a medical issue. I want to make sure about safety, as Ari was talking about, have, testing done. But when it comes down to it, I don't need to go through a medical procedure because that's not where I'm at.
I like to weigh in just for one moment. So, there's no question that people that are born without sperm, that are using sperm, clearly there's no obvious medical issue. But if you look at the redefinition that the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, ASRM, has done, and they obviously put a lot of thought into this, and the WHO, is they define any type of fertility barrier, whether real or perceived, as part of infertility. So meaning if you don't have sperm in your network and you need sperm, you've got a fertility issue. And so the idea of that was not to over-medicalize the process, but to break the stigma and to say, look, like, needing sperm may have some issues around it. You shouldn't have to go into the dark alleys to access it. It should be something that you can feel comfortable and supported and protected. So that's where it really comes from. And I know that there is some pushback on that. But if you subscribe to guidelines, if you subscribe to professional agencies, that is the most current definition, and maybe we'll post that on the Fertility Matters Canada website, of infertility encompasses all forms of third party, which, to your point, Sarah, it's not really capital I infertility, but it does represent a fertility barrier. So that's my position with all of it.
It's a barrier, and I think it should be like the same way, Fertility Matters Canada, we care about everyone, how they're building their family, whether it's for a specific medical need or otherwise. But at the same time, I think part of respecting that is that everyone's journeys look different and their needs might be different, and how they feel about how they build their family, I think, should be up to them, really. And I don't think you're saying otherwise, but I think they get to determine what it looks like to build their family. I'm not seeing this, thank God, with people they met down the street or online when it comes to home insemination. I'm seeing like we're a 2-mom family and my wife's brother is going to be our sperm donor, or whatever it is like that, or a friend from high school or whatever it is. So these are usually people they know well, and part of the benefit for most people is they're considering, for the donor conceived person, that child when they're growing up, what if they want to know who the donor is? What do they want that to look like? So this is the stigma has gotten so much less in this. I see this all the time. I think it's a wonderful way to build a family as long as we're safe with it. Ontario and BC are, in particular, the legislation has gone so far here, and there's nowhere in Canada, there is in places like California, etc., there's nowhere in Canada that differentiates between sperm donation in or outside of a clinic. Same with traditional and gestational surrogacy, by the way. There's no legal difference between them. It's just the way we understand these things, or actual practice, what they look like.
That's really important. Ari?
Well, I was just saying we're getting close to
Yeah.
the hour, but what I would say, just from perspective and breaking stigma, I mean, I remember I've been doing this for over almost 20 years, and I remember when a donor cycle, I'm not talking about donor sperm, I'm talking about donor eggs and surrogacy, was coming into the clinic, it was like stop the presses. Like we didn't even know how to handle it. We'd have to recruit a special nurse to do it, and everyone felt like they were moving mountains. I think the patients felt like something wasn't right. The providers felt, why is this so strange? And then today, it's like every day I'm dealing with probably a dozen third-party related issues. And so I think that's one of the take-homes, is that this is very doable. It is a bit like architecture. There is a way to construct this in a safe way, a sustainable way, an environmentally friendly way, like so that you can really do something special. And I would say in my practice, some of the most gratifying experiences have been with the third party, in the third party space.
Amazing. And just before I wrap up, Sarah, you had mentioned something, and I think it's really important to mention to everybody here that yes, there's a medical and the clinical and that clinical space. Yes, we have, we want you to be working with fertility lawyers to have your consultation and ensure that you're getting sound legal advice. Also, there are amazing reproductive mental health specialists, and we really encourage everybody to have that as part of their team moving through this. So if you're looking for information on a clinic, a fertility lawyer, or a reproductive mental health specialist, reproductive therapist, please reach out to Fertility Matters. We can give you a list of those individuals for you to reach out to. Dr. Baratz, Sara, thank you so much for participation in this session. We probably could have made it another hour and we wouldn't have gotten through all of the questions. Thank you for your expertise and your time. If we did not get to your questions today, we're going to take those away, or you can reach out to us directly, and we want to make sure that you have the information that you need. This has been brought to you by our friends at First Response. We're very grateful for their partnership so that we can continue to bring education, resources, tools, and advocacy to you on behalf of you, the Canadian fertility patient, for free. Thank you for being here. We've got a whole lineup of webinars coming this fall, so make sure you stay tuned on our social media for ways to participate. Thanks so much, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, Carolynn.